Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and I look a little fuzzy. Do not adjust your sets. It's just my internet. All right. Welcome here. It is late April, and great to see everybody already in the chat. Lots of hellos and how are ya, and a talk of the weather. And oh my goodness, what a spring this is already. So yes, Manitoba is getting walloped. That's with a capital WH, walloped again with another snowstorm. Absolutely ridiculous out that way. But as producer Jay will attest, the dome of dryness over the Lethbridge area continues. It's almost ridiculous how much there is like a perfect circle around Lethbridge when they start calling for moisture, and it just goes around Lethbridge. So I don't know what you did, producer Jay, but you need to, I don't know, atone for something, I'm sure. All right, so shout out, of course, to everybody in the comments. I see Ray DeBanco's here, and Peter Johnson is there. Jason Vogt, thank you, and Kevin is there as well, out from BC. So great to see everybody. And Farmer Jim, hi. It's good to see you here. Okay, tonight, of course, we are going to talk about herbicide resistance management. But before we get there, a quick note, of course, if you are into collecting CEU credits, please head over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow. Let us know that you joined us on this broadcast, and you can qualify for those CEU credits. As always, our show is brought to you by Adama Canada and Mind Your Farm Business and Real Ag Radio. And we actually... really exciting. We actually have a guest from Adama Canada today, so that's pretty exciting. While other sources of innovation run dry, Adama is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your Adama sales rep today. And I did want to send a shout out to Wheat Pete, who is in the comments today. If anyone caught Real Ag Radio today, it is Agronomic Monday, and it was basically the Peter Johnson, Sean Haney show, and it was a really good show. I listened to it while I made dinner tonight. And so check it out. You can head over to realagriculture.com/radio, and you can actually listen to all past episodes there. All right, without further ado, let's bring in the guests. Here we have Rob Bahry of Adama Canada and Marc Maisonneuve with Corteva. Welcome here, Rob. Welcome here, Marc.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
All righty. Okay, so, all right. Now, this is exciting. So, Marc, I just discovered, is actually here in Ottawa. So we're only about, as the crow flies, a couple miles apart. But Marc, tell me a bit about the area that you work in with Corteva. How long have you been in the Ottawa area?
Okay, there's a little bit of history maybe in the first decade, that coming from Alberta out of school and working in central and northern Alberta, BC. But yeah, in the last couple decades, then it had been more around the Ottawa area, Eastern Ontario, into Quebec, and a little bit more recently, though we've made a few changes out towards the central part of Ontario as well, and supporting our Ontario team from a crop protection standpoint as a specialist, or one in training, or one still learning like everybody else, I'm sure.
If I knew it all, it probably means I'm well retired. Now, Rob, where are you based? And tell us a bit about what you do with Adama Canada.
Hi, Lindsay. I'm the development manager for Adama Canada, based out of Winnipeg. Prairie boy, born and raised in southern Manitoba. Was in Regina for a few years earlier in my career, or a few months, I should say, on a contract, but been primarily in Manitoba since. Spent most of my time on a dairy farm in my teens and my childhood before I went to ag school. Loved science, loved applied science. Agriculture was a great career. So great combination of city and country life for me.
Absolutely. All right. Okay. So tonight, of course, the topic being herbicide resistance management. We are going to take this in any direction our guests want to take it, or, of course, you, the audience, want to ask questions. But one of the key things that we are going to talk about tonight is, the full spectrum of all the tools in the toolbox of what we have and what we can do to help manage herbicide resistance. And one of these key things, of course, right now is in building that plan, in what you've got going on now. Usually, and Rob, maybe I'll start with you. This really does need to be a several year sort of plan and discussion. So walk me through that process.
Well, sure, it's certainly an integrated approach. There's many factors affecting herbicide performance. Of course, we've got to get the active ingredient into the plant, whether that's through the foliage or the stem, or even via the roots, depending on the mode of action. There's 19 different herbicide groups that are listed in the Manitoba Crop Protection Guide for controlling weeds. And for the most part, they work quite well. But as we're painfully aware, after a number of seasons of using the same mode of action repeatedly, we can develop a resistance to one or more herbicide groups. And there's lots of details behind that I'm sure we'll get into over the next hour.
Absolutely. Now, Marc, we are, of course, tonight going to dig into some of the major issues that we've got in Ontario. What weed or weeds are producers really struggling with right now in Ontario?
Well, in Ontario, there is a bit of a split, because in Western Ontario they've had about 10 years of dealing and managing with Canada fleabane, and in the last couple of years, more recently, water hemp being probably the biggest concern, and management is really important around that. We've also got some of those heads ups in the east side too, where we've been managing some of the glyphosate resistance coming off of Group 2, or triazine resistance, and working on a lot of different mixes that will support growers. And in working with Corteva Agriscience, we have several combinations that do exactly that. So those are the two sort of primary weeds I think that get a lot of attention. But we can't forget the importance around controlling lamb's quarters and ragweed, velvet leaf, and pigweeds, and many of the regular culprits at the late night party.
Right. And in Manitoba and Western Canada, up the Red River Valley, water hemp is becoming an issue here too, coming from the U.S. Midwest. Our main issues out here are wild oats resistant to Group 1 and Group 2 herbicides. About a quarter of the fields have those resistant wild oats in them now. Kochia resistant to Group 2. Essentially, all kochia is considered resistant to ALS inhibitors now, and kochia resistance is a growing problem here as well.
So and it does bring up, and it's definitely something that I want to tackle a little later, is if you suspect that you've got a problem, how you sort of what the process is to perhaps confirm that problem. But I want to back up a little bit first. Kara actually has a great question. Rob, you mentioned 19 registered groups in Manitoba. Is the number the same across the country? This is actually a really great question. In that if you've traveled at all across Canada and worked in agriculture, you'll realize Ontario has a whole bunch of products that we don't necessarily get in the West. But does Ontario, I suppose specifically, have access to groups we don't have in the West?
I, I don't believe there's groups that Ontario would have. There's certainly particular products that Ontario and Quebec have access to that are not registered in Western Canada, and the vice versa is also true. But I don't think there's any specific groups that
Okay.
are lacking in Western Canada. Just on the side, yeah, the weed guide or crop protection guide lists 19 groups, and another search on the internet I found 19 groups as well. So I believe that that nomenclature is consistent across Canada. But maybe Mark, you could respond to that for the East.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And my experience goes back to, northern Alberta farming and hearing about kochia in southern Alberta. And eventually we had some of our annuals that were resistant to, some of the different groups there. And then the groups definitely expanded. But we are dealing with some of the same chemistry, just sometimes variation of the molecules and what would be registered in soybeans and corn versus
Mm.
wheat and canola and lentils, for example. But the underlying, theme is the same, where we've had, some increases in changes in the genetic output of some of these resistant weeds, coupled with some developments in the herbicide end. But we do know that there's a lot of other factors and cultural practices, crop rotation, other management practices we can put on our side to manage these troublesome weeds, regardless of their geography and also by using the different groups of chemistry.
Hmm. Now, I still want to know what group hand roguing falls under. And
Very
I'm going to
cultural.
assume, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll start there.
Combination of
I,
cultural and mechanical.
yeah, exactly. So, Rob, I want to go back to wild oats for a second, although because we do, of course, focus quite a bit on kochia for the West. I mean, for good reason. It's a troublesome weed. It spreads quickly. It does a multi-resistance. But why do we have the wild oat resistance problem? Maybe walk us through how we got here, because I think it's a great example of the different ways that weeds can develop resistance.
Sure. So I believe wild oat group 1 resistance in Manitoba was discovered in approximately 1991. So it's been around for about 30 years now. And as I mentioned, about a quarter of the fields in Western Canada now are considered to have resistance to both group 1 and group 2 resistant wild oats in the same field. And that number is expected to grow up to 40%. I'm just looking, if you want to, Jay, if you want to flip to slide 10, maybe we can talk about the two types of resistance,
Yeah, super.
if you
Yep.
want to throw it up there. But there's metabolic resistance and target site resistance. Those are the two main types of resistance. There's also a conjugation that happens more rarely, but we talk about metabolic and target site as being the two primary types of resistance. The one that happens the quickest and the group that's at highest risk, again, as pointed out in the Manitoba Crops Protection Guide, are group 1s and 2s to wild oats to group 1s and 2s. And that's in part due to the target site resistance mechanism. That occurs when mutations at the site of action prevent the herbicide from killing the weed or crop because the herbicide can't bind at the target site. So the weed is not affected by the herbicide. That happens after maybe 7 or 8 applications of the group 1, for example, the same herbicide group or mode of action that applies high selection pressure. And over time, we select for the mutant or resistant biotypes. And within 7 or 8 generations, we can have a field that's primarily resistant to group 1 wild oats. And that's what we've seen happen to many fields in Western Canada over the last 30 years.
So, sorry, 7 or 8 times? That's all it takes?
Yep. High risk groups like group 1 and
Yeah.
2, less than 10 applications, you can get herbicide resistance develop. 7, 8 generations, it can happen quite quickly, less than 10 applications.
Okay. So now there are sort of high risk all the way through to lower risk, but there really isn't. I mean, if we're using a herbicide, we're applying a selection pressure. So there are lower risk products, but there's there is no risk product, right, to developing resistant?
That's correct. All herbicides are subject to resistance developing. The highest risk products are related to target site resistance, like the group 1 and group 2. But metabolic resistance can occur with all groups, including group 1. You can have wild oats, for example, that are resistant to, that have both metabolic resistance and target site herbicide resistance. The metabolic resistance definitely takes a longer period of time to develop. So glyphosate, for example, is a group 9. It's considered a low risk category, but as we're painfully aware, there are a number of weeds after decades of repeated use, sometimes many times in the same year. We've developed metabolic resistance to glyphosate from a number of species. So it takes longer, but it can occur over many generations.
Okay, so Marc, let's move into some of the discussion on Palmer amaranth, water hemp. We can also talk about fleabane if you really want to. But why are certain weeds more prone to developing resistance? So Peter Johnson says pigweed was first in Ontario to develop resistance to atrazine. Water hemp and Palmer amaranth are in the same genus, but redroot pigweed is not cross resistant. So we've got species, we've got selection pressure. Why do we see some weeds develop resistance quicker, or perhaps so faster than others, or that it doesn't happen in other species?
Well, I think coming off of that last slide and that little discussion is really key because it doesn't have to be consecutive applications. But nonetheless, the more selection pressure or the increase in efficacy that a particular molecule will give on a particular weed species, the more likely you're going to have some off types and biotypes that become resistant. And as we get our 95 or 97% control, there's obviously going to be that 1, 2, or 3%, maybe depending on staging, but also just depending on some of the conditions. Either way, you're going to have some of these active ingredients that are going to be very high efficacy. But again, if we rely on that group and repeatedly, we're asking for trouble. So look at some of the development with the pigweed and the amaranth piece, and you look at some of the history in the U.S. Either way, you still have kind of worked through those same patterns of using those same groups, regularly year after year. And of course, you can think of some of the pigweed family with group 2, then it became triazines, and then we've kind of realized that none of these groups are safe. We have to be using them in combinations and regularly throughout the season, and look at our optimal timing, whether it be in a burn down, pre-emergent window, an early post window, mid post, late post, in crop, tank mixed, with a fungicide. You look at the Enlist soybean system, that would be another example there. And then you've got also your post harvest window where you're hitting, the weed with a different mode of action at a different life cycle. So I would say it's complex, but the more we simplify the fact that we need to do all these things and look at, our full list of and our full arsenal, and look at our different windows of opportunity throughout the season, that's probably going to give us our best chance, going forward to manage some of these weeds. And one thing that, and I'll highlight that Peter Sikkema had put out a couple of really important tweets, where some of the actives, like a group 27, will be more efficacious on water hemp control in the pre-emergent window versus the post-emergent window. And again, depending on sizing, and once some weeds are bolted, they're very, they're that much more difficult to control. So, staging is very important, but also, the windows of application that might lend itself better to pre or post emergent control, it should also be looked at. And I see that also when you look at some of the, we talk about target site, but then we also talk about some of the weed biology. Why is chlorimuron or classic excellent on controlling lamb's quarters pre-emergent, and yet post-emergent, we have to rely on another, another active. So as it relates to sizing, staging, I think you got a good picture there. We're going from a dime to a quarter. That certainly can be, the size that you're looking at, depending on the active you're using. There are others that are just, that much more efficacious. So, 5, 6 inches across is not out of the norm, or 5, 6 inches tall, and getting, excellent control, let's say, of fleabane with a product like Pixero. So once you're into that, and I appreciate that picture, because once you're into year 2, year 3, year 4,
Forest.
just imagine the
Yeah.
problem getting worse and worse and worse if it's not being attacked with the right combination of chemistry, timing throughout the season, and really planning, from one crop rotation to the next.
And to your original
Absolutely.
question,
We actually have,
Lindsay,
I'm going to go to our, oh, yeah, go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to throw in to your original question. It's a numbers game. Plants like kochia that have a huge amount of seeds. If there's 1 in a billion, 1 in a million mutants in there, it doesn't take long for that resistant population to build up. Or foxtail, where less seeds per plant, but millions of plants per acre.
Hmm.
Excellent point, and especially
Um,
those weeds that can give
yeah.
off 100,000 seeds per plant. Fleabane being one of them, but there are many others that can catch us off guard as to how severe and how prolific they can be.
Hmm. When you say mutant, Rob, all I can think of is X-Men. So I just have visions of how we're going to work this into a new school, with our mutant weeds. Okay, I want to. This does bring up, though. I do have a clip here with Eric Johnson, I believe, talking about herbicide layering. And so, to your point, Mark, and about that sort of, not just about picking the product, but picking our timing, and in combination with potentially another time, another product, planning for that year. So, um, Jay, let's go to that clip, and then we've got some great questions coming in through the chat.
Okay, herbicide layering is not a new concept. It's been around for a while. It differs from tank mixing in that we're applying a pre-herbicide, pre-seed or pre-emerge herbicide, so it's a soil active herbicide. And then following it with a post-emergence herbicide with a different mode of action. So the concept is really to use that pre-herbicide as a setup treatment to not totally control all the weeds that you want to control, but at least reduce the densities. And the concept being with fewer weeds post-emergence, you take a lot of pressure off your post-emergence herbicide treatment and reduce the risk of herbicide resistance. So a tank mix is really a single application where you're applying two or three different modes of action, maybe more, at the same time. In this case, we're not applying at the same time, we're really applying them sequentially. But the idea is similar. We're trying to use multiple modes of action in the same year, because we know that tank mixing or using multiple modes of action of herbicides is one of the best ways to reduce or delay the onset of herbicide resistance. The other thing about it is you may be in a situation where we don't have a herbicide that will provide perfect control of a weed. And one of the examples would be Cleavers in field peas on soils with high organic matter. So we have products like sulfentrazone that have some activity on it, pre-emergence, and then we have some products like bentazone and the Mazamox post-emergence that have some effect, but nothing perfect. But when you combine the two together, the pre and the post, you end up with additive weed control and satisfactory weed control. Well, that's one of the main benefits. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're doing it, is trying to manage herbicide resistance or delay the onset of it. But the other aspect of it is that there are some difficult to control weeds. We're not getting a lot of new herbicide options for pulse growers. In some cases, we'll find a herbicide like peroxysulfone, for example, relatively new herbicide that has some activity on a particular weed, but it may be just suppression. And so by using that herbicide plus a post-emergent herbicide that might not be also highly effective, but combining the two, we can prove efficacy. So it's really two factors we're trying to do, improve weed control efficacy and delay the onset of herbicide resistance. Well, one of the studies that we've done, I should point out right from the start that the work is just started, so it's fairly limited right now. Where we have focused primarily on is Cleavers control, Cleavers in field pea, and these would be on soils with higher than 8% organic matter.
We hadn't even talked about cleavers yet. I'm so glad he brought it up. I actually hate cleavers. They just feel icky. Anyway, so some great comments there from Eric about layering and how layering is different than a tank mix. So similar idea of course, using multiple modes of effective action, but targeting different times of year to use them, potentially in a single pass or maybe a different tank mix. And so I think it sets us up well for some of the questions that have come in. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to go through a few of them. Let's talk no-till and chem fallow. So this is out from BC, but has no-till and chem fallow practices accelerated chemical resistance in some of these weeds? Who wants to take that first? Rob, do you want to take a crack at it?
Sure, definitely with glyphosate it has. I mean, no-till, zero-till, caused the explosion of glyphosate use, which only contributed to glyphosate-resistant weeds over time. It took, decades, but we certainly got there. And without no-till, we likely would not have the extent of glyphosate-resistant weeds that we see now.
Mm-hmm. But we'd
Yeah, I would
probably
concur
also
with
have
that
less
too.
organic matter. Yeah. So, and this is the double-edged sword, though, right? Is that no-till is great for many other reasons, and did simplify weed control, but by simplifying that weed control, we have put too much pressure on some of the weed species by using a single product.
Right. So that comes back to Eric's point about mixing it up. You can still, even with no-till or minimal till, consider putting down group threes, even on the surface, as an example, for a base layer to help mitigate the resistant population, the weed population in general, before seeding a pulse, for example, or even canola. So there are still, we can add tank mixes to our glyphosate to, again, add another mode of action in the fall or in the spring prior to seeding. So there are some mitigation activities we can take even in no-till, zero-till situations.
Mm-hmm. Mark, I'll ask you, are we officially past using glyphosate alone for weed control? Is there still a time and place for just glyphosate on its own?
I think we were officially past that about 5 years ago, but I know that it's still being used. And what do you do when you put a liter of glyphosate on? Well, put 2 liters then, and at multiple times during the season. And that's just simply bad practices. At Corteva, we like to take a program approach. And I'll give you an example, like in soybeans, where we're using, group 2, maybe for some of the other benefits around residual for, lamb's quarters. That's harder to control post-emergent, especially when you get hot, humid conditions. And especially when it comes to group 9s like glyphosate that have particularly a little bit more trouble cutting through that waxy cuticle at that time too, even with the help of some stronger surfactants. You also have some group 5s, in a product like Canopy, or the combinations of group 14s in a product like Diligent, or the use of Valterra. We do have some tools there, and it was, as was mentioned, it's layered, but we call it a program approach, where you're using some of these modes of action early and getting a jump on these weeds in their germination phase prior to. And as we mentioned, with glyphosate being used, especially more in no-till, and yes, there's a lot of benefits to that, but you take a weed like Canada fleabane that doesn't like tillage, and now you've just given it, carte blanche in your no-till field.
Rob, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, it is a tough one. I mean, in the dry land, you commented about the drought in the Lethbridge area. Boy, guys sure don't want to till if they don't have to. In some cases, you might be forced to, but moisture is king. Um, so you're still forced to do the best agronomic practice you can, and then try to apply the tools that are available, glyphosate mixes and other other options. It's not simple though if you can't till. Certainly, the lack of tillage does contribute to the proliferation of other weeds that, as Mark said, don't like tillage, and there's dandelions and others, right? So there's always a
It's always
reaction, right?
exactly. I was just going to say one of the fascinating things, of course, is when we adapt our system, the biology just adapts too, right? So if you move to, you move away from tillage, you're going to start to see those plants that also love to be undisturbed. So they're going to start to do better. And if you move, which is why, we're talking about this layering. So we're talking about, pre-emerge or in crop or post harvest, that looking at all the different times of year that you could be potentially managing weeds, and maybe we've got time at some point to even talk about at harvest, maybe some of those mechanical means and those sorts of things as well. I know we have talked about certainly what some of those options are for destroying weed seeds at harvest, but of course that only brings up, or that only controls those that are setting seed then, right? There might have been some that went to seed months before or a month before harvest. It doesn't really do anything for them. But now we have a question here. Please talk also about how to handle the use of pre-emergent herbicides in a no-till system. Mark, do you want to address that one, or Rob, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can. I mean, we still are, in some cases, to
Okay.
get the broadest spectrum on the non-resistant glyphosate weeds. There are lots of aspects around glyphosate group 9 that are still good, and in combination with other modes of action, whether you're controlling dandelion a little bit better, you've got some annuals that are out, but certainly in the pre-emergent window, it's a nice opportunity if you are tank mixing with the glyphosate. If you're not, you're obviously relying on some knockdown. So that's important to note. Is a product going to give you the right knockdown? Is the stage of the weeds important, and are they present? If it's more from an anti-germination standpoint, are they going to need some soil moisture or actual rain for activation? In most cases, a lot of the group 15s, for example, even group 14s will need up to half an inch of rain for activation. So that'll be a key part of the weed control, the performance. And at the same time, you are doing the best you can in that window. And I think it's important to control some weeds and reduce that weed pressure, through that initial critical weed-free period, so that you can then use some tools in crop, whether it's enlist beans, or whether you're using your group 27s and group 15 combinations in corn, and then rotating again to your group 4s in wheat. So, at any opportunity you have to get a group that's going to give you the best weed control in that window, you have to take advantage of it.
Now,
I
Peter does
agree.
point out, sorry, I'm just gonna, before you get a chance here, Rob, the question does come from Brazil, and Peter suspects they may have different conditions than we do, but I can't imagine them being any different at all. Okay, so sorry, Rob, go ahead. Dealing, yes, with pre-emergent herbicide in a no-till system.
Yeah, when I heard the word pre-emerge, for some reason, my head jumped to like harrowing in, and I'm trying to think, well, how do you incorporate in a no-till system, right? But no, to Mark's point, there's a number of options, whether it's pre-seed or pre-emerge prior to the crop coming up. There's a number of options, 14, 15, et cetera, depending on the crop, of course. But there are a number of options that can be used alone or with glyphosate in a pre-seed or pre-emerge situation, whether it's no-till or not. So unless there's a nuance to the question that I'm missing, yeah, there are lots of options.
Probably one thing to really highlight though is that you will have weeds that won't be emerged and or won't be controlled as well in that pre-emergent window. So when I think of soybeans and even corn to some extent, when we're dealing with milkweed or nut sedge, if we haven't had the opportunity to incorporate group 15, for example, we're going to need to control those post-emergent. So there will be limitations nonetheless in why you're going to use that program in the pre-emergent window, and take care of as many annuals and try to eliminate as many annuals as you go into the critical weed-free period, so that when those perennials or weeds that simply thrive off more heat before they come, and I think of milkweed and even ragweed to some extent. Giant foxtail is an excellent example that you won't see those till they're we're well into June, and we've got that many more heat units to germinate the seeds from the seed bed.
Yeah, the sweet spot to me is trying to find a good residual product that will give you prolonged weed control pre-seed or pre-emerge, but that minimizes the effect on recropping, and that's very difficult to find a herbicide that does both, particularly in pulses in Western Canada. You can usually have one or the other, but it's hard to find any that do both.
Choices. Now, so Peter brings up a good point, and it's sort of, to me, it's deciding in this planning process, is suppression good enough? Is that all we can do for certain weeds? Do we always target that 97, 98% control? And so his question is, if we're talking about layering, so we're talking about, preceding or pre-emerge, we're talking post-emerge or in-crop, is there a risk of going with this layering idea and setting the weed back, and the weed then is sort of hardened off from that damage and is less susceptible to a second pass? Does that situation occur or exist? Do we know?
I don't associate layering with suppression. I associate layering with just using multiple modes of action in the same crop season. Fall, pre-seed, in-crop, pre-harvest. So many modes of action over the course of the growing season. So I don't think it necessarily has to be, suppression or control. But specifically with respect to suppression, to me, with target site resistance, it probably doesn't matter that much. But when it comes to metabolic resistance, I think you need to strive, or you want to strive for good control. If you're only suppressing it, you're setting the weeds up over generations. And there has been some studies that have shown that creeping resistance, metabolic resistance, will develop over a number of generations from sublethal dosing. So the general recommendation is to use the optimal rate to get good control, particularly with respect to metabolic resistance.
I too would add to that metabolic resistance being important. If you're getting 80% or a suppression level that's adequate, we're still weighing off the benefits of that level of control, with possibly some new seed germinating, and as long as there's some active growth, that next mode of action, which will rely probably more so on a target site, and some more active growth to bring that active ingredient down into the root system, will still be sufficient. But I understand where Peter's coming from too, because in some cases we don't have the conditions that allow us to get as good active weed growth, whether it's respraying for grasses or respraying for broadleafs. It is a concern when we get into hot, dry conditions, where we just don't have that weed growth activity. And a lot of times post-emergent, it's a crucial piece of it. We seem to struggle less with that in most of our corn mixes and wheat for that matter, but it certainly can affect the group ones, for example, and out west, maybe more commonly in those areas. But also we've dealt with group one, and it's not resistance; it's just difficult, activity on the metabolic sites for grass control in IP soybeans in particular.
So to me,
Right.
when we're
So this is a
spraying,
key point. Yeah. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
to me, when we're spraying, we should strive for the best control we can. That being said, we probably need to be more judicious in our spraying activities. We don't have to spray wall to wall all the time like we have, historically.
Mhm.
Um, be more accepting of some little bit dirtier fields, et cetera, just to break the cycle if necessary, or just spray the patches or just spray the border. So we probably could be more judicious, but when we do spray, I still would advocate for optimizing our control.
Okay, so it's like we planned it, gentlemen. You've actually segued into my next clip, and there are only two, so I'm very proud of myself for getting to both of them. So I do have a clip here because is with Dale Cowan, and it brings in this discussion of sort of the sanitation, if you will, of keeping, field margins or ditches or these sorts of things. So managing weeds maybe outside the field, or potentially keeping an eye on some of these species creeping in from other areas. And so, Jay, if we can go to the second clip, and then we've got some great comments to come back to here.
So I just got back from the Commodity Classic in California, and lots of farmers there, of course. And I started talking to some farmers from Mississippi on how they handle all their resistant weeds. And of course, Palmer amaranth is the nasty one down there. And I ran into some large farmers, 12,000 plus acres, and they have 2 full-time sprayers that do nothing all year long but spray waste areas for Palmer amaranth before it gets an inch tall. So I got thinking back home is, what do we do in our waste areas? And we don't do much on purpose. And so when you start thinking about weed resistance management, you really have to start reducing the size of the seed weed bank. And of course, the way you do that is don't let weeds go to seed. And so our Canada fleabane is probably our biggest nemesis right now. And at least in the Southwest, we've managed to handle it in our soybean fields where it's predominantly a problem. And when we look at some of these waste areas, you take a fence line, say 1,000 feet long and 3 feet wide, and let's just say there's a fleabane plant every square foot. If that all sets seed, that's enough weed seeds to populate a 50-acre field at 275 plants per square foot. So when you start thinking of, well, how do we develop resistance management, or resistant weeds rather, and when you start looking, it's just a numbers game. So if you only allow, say, 30 weed seeds per acre, and most scientists will tell us every billion seeds is a resistant biotype. So you have to look at 10 million acres to find your first resistant biotype. But if you get to 3.2 million seeds per acre, you only have to look at 300 acres to find your first resistant biotype, which is what the case is with Canada fleabane. So then you say, well, what farmer would ever get to 3.2 million acres of seed? Well, it's 17 fleabane plants per acre going to seed. So it doesn't take long with these prolific seed producers to get there. And the significance is, of course, is the alternative chemistry. The more weed seeds it has to deal with, the greater selection pressure. So as we rotate into residuals and other modes of action, we want them to last longer. We have to start reducing the amount of weeds that they're having to face. So I'm thinking, getting back to looking at some of these waste areas, the fence lines, that little triangle piece in the corner, do a good job in the field, and yet we let these waste areas go to seed. And something like Canada fleabane is airborne seed distribution. And so it really becomes a community weed, not just a farmer's weed. So I think we're going to have some conversation with our growers here to start looking at some of these waste areas and just keep that reseeding of these nasty weeds down on our farms this year.
I'm just going to hop in here and say that you can fence off those areas and sheep will eat weeds. Anyway, that's my little plug. I happen to have some sheep that would do it. Anyway, and wouldn't that be that's a cultural mode of action, would it not be? Right? Okay. Adding the
Definitely, and
layers.
definitely on the right track.
Yeah. There you go. I can't imagine many farmers, though, fencing off small pieces and putting in sheep and then, taking care of them all day. But definitely something to think about, though, in thinking about, field margins or ditches or exactly that, an area where, especially understanding the type of weed you're up against, if it is dispersed by wind, allowing something next to your field to go to seed is just as bad as essentially having it in your field. So I think my colleague Kara pipes in that her goats would also eat them. So it is the battle of the ruminants. Okay, so this does bring up, though, a really great discussion about some of these very prolific weeds and about how resistance spreads. And so Peter Sikkema recently tweeted that common ragweed resistant to glyphosate has been found in Simcoe County, but it was only in Essex before. So did it jump that far? Or Mark, how do you think, have we just not detected it in between? Or how do these sorts of things happen in different counties and not the ones in between,
Well,
potentially?
I think you touched on a couple of things there, and I think as we detection is one, and testing is another, for sure that will help map these things out, and we see that in the medical industry as well. We come up with more cases, and it sometimes it's just because the diagnostics have been improved and are more prolific. So that's one piece for sure. The other piece is just we've got wind, we've got birds. We've got machinery that's moving around. There's a lot of things going on that moving, whether it's watersheds and so on. Weeds will find a way, and I found, you touch on it. We joke about the goats, but the reality is a mower can do a lot of good too in the ditches and some of these corners. You look at with urban expansion and the lack of use of regular pesticides in some cases, and they have their reasons for that. But the reality is, the more that's managed, especially a weed that's in the vegetative stage is is one thing. But if you let your dandelions go to seed and you're letting that seed, and be it ragweed as well, one of the worst allergenics out there. You know darn well that mowing and managing its spread is really key. So that's sort of been the approach, and I will say that I see often that they don't catch it before the weed goes to seed. But whether it's ragweed or
Mhm.
dandelion, I mean, mowing is a common urban practice, and I think we've been pretty good. I drive by a lot of laneways, a lot of ditches if they can be mowed, and in and around the watersheds and where the tiles are draining, keeping those fairly clean. It's going to help. It's going to make a difference. There's never one thing, but it's one of those things that we can do.
Now, Rob, you've also got some great tips on exactly that, the detection and the testing. So I want to talk a little bit about that before we move into, maybe we'll wrap up tonight's discussion with sort of outlining, all the different things we can be doing, obviously, to manage resistance. But if an agronomist does suspect that they're dealing with resistance, or a farmer suspects they're dealing with a resistant biotype or species, what's the best sort of way forward from there? How do you test for it?
Sure, it's on slide 9, Jay, if you want to throw it up there, but I can talk to it. For detecting herbicide resistance, have to scout, of course. Look for escapes that cannot be explained by application errors or environmental conditions. If you see susceptible weeds that were killed, but others that were not, that tells you that the herbicide was working, but there's something else going on. Look for healthy weeds of the same species near dead ones, particularly in patches that, resistant weeds that any weeds like wild oats, for example, tend to occur in patches within the fields. So it's just basic scouting and, some basic observation in the field will give you some yellow or red flags whether you potentially have it. Now, the confirmation process is quite onerous today. You have to collect the mature seeds from the weeds in question, grow them in pots, spray them out with various herbicides, and then evaluate the level of control. There are standardized methods that some labs will do that for you, but it takes months, and it's a diagnostic procedure. It doesn't really help you proactively. Now, in other parts of the world, there are methodologies that are in use for detecting resistance within a day or two from foliage at the very young stage. Blackgrass, for example, in the UK, they can take foliage from 2 to 3 leaf blackgrass leaves, and within a few hours or a couple of days from some diagnostic procedures in the lab, tell you if it's resistant to a group 1, for example. So we're investigating those types of tools here in Canada to see if we can adapt a diagnostic tool like that for wild oats, for example, to group 1 and potentially other modes of action. We're not there yet, but maybe within a couple of years we might have some better ways of being proactive for detecting resistance instead of reactive like we are today.
Right. That is one of the challenges for sure. Hey, maybe, Elon Musk bought Twitter today. Maybe he could buy, some sort of testing company and we could have this solved in like a year. Throw some money at a problem and we can solve all of them. Peter did note with our talking about waste areas if you are going to control weeds in those waste areas, please don't eliminate everything by using a non-selective like glyphosate, because of course then you eliminate all the competition and those nasty things come back. That's also a good rule of thumb if you're ever dealing with things like some of these burning plants, like wild parsnip or hogweed. Much better to target the exact plants. And if you're going to mow, please wear protective gear. Not like the one neighbor I saw who was using a weed whacker and no protective gear. Had to yell and say, "Don't stop." Okay, it's just awful. Anyway, let's sort of wrap up tonight with walk us through. We're going to talk about several of these different points. But Jay, I'm not sure. Did you grab? I forget which slide number it is. Sorry, it escapes me right now. But one of Rob's slides that does have a really great list. It starts with diversity, and a competitive crop, and scouting and scoring. So, Rob, maybe I'll start with you. Walk us
Sure.
through some of that list of all the different things we need to be doing to
So that
try
is
and delay or manage.
slide 11, Jay. And that's a list put
There
together
you go.
from Dr. Hugh Becky a few years ago at a presentation. And yeah, he listed 10 very good management practices for helping to prevent and manage herbicide resistance. And that includes crop diversity, so having good crop rotations, mixing up fall crops with spring crops if possible, using a competitive crop and practices that promote good crop competition. Scouting before and after spraying, even scouting from the combine. I like that phrase. You need to know what you have so that you can manage it to the best of your abilities. Probably the most practical thing that growers and applicators can do that we've talked about already is this herbicide mixing. Try to use 2 or 3 different modes of action on the same species when all 3 or all 2 modes of actions are effective on that particular species. That's definitely better than rotation. I like the phrase that I think it was Dr. Pat Trinnell in the US from the University of Illinois coined that rotating buys you time, mixing buys you shots. So maybe you can get dozens of applications out of your group 1 and group 2, for example, if you apply them in the same year to the same generation of wild oats, whereas you only get maybe 7 or 8 applications of either one just from rotating. So mixing is certainly key. Herbicide group rotation, it's better than not rotating at all, but not as good as mixing. Hugh referred to in-crop weed selective herbicide rotation. I think that specifically is like if you use a group 1 and then you have some escapes, spot spray for group 2 or vice versa. So, with wild oats being such a key problem for group 1 and group 2 resistance in Western Canada, he was focusing on using more than one group if possible in that same year. Again, back to that mixing concept, layering, if at all possible. We talked about weed sanitation, border control to slow the movement of weeds and seeds. Manage your field specifically. Not one size doesn't fit all. Don't just buy one herbicide, one group 1, and use it across your farm. Manage each field as it makes sense, and even sometimes within fields, you may want to split it depending on your particular situation. Strategic tillage or cutting before the seed set, weed patches, for example, if practical. If you have cattle, if you have the ability to use forages for a few years to break the cycle, that's a great solution. Not very practical for a lot of people, but it's great if you can do that. And again, record keeping, maintaining a database so that you know your situation, so that you can best manage it going forward. That's all from Hugh Becky a few years ago.
Great list. Now, Mark, Gord's got a great question here. Gord Speck-Snyder. I learned how to say his last name, so now I say it as much as I can. Because it builds on this. So for a given crop rotation, is it good enough to use a similar herbicide program, yes, with multi-modes of action, for each rotation period, or should we switch up the programs over time? Which I think is a really great question. So if every time I grow wheat, should I be using the same products, even though they're tank mixed or whatever, or should every time I grow wheat in that rotation, should I be trying to switch up the groups? How would you approach that?
I mean, I think if you're rotating your crops already, you're off to a good start. And yes, it is a good practice to look at the different modes of action, and if you can change those groups. Again, you know, as mentioned earlier, 7 years or 10 years, you know, the development of resistance. But we know that for most weeds and most groups, are resistant to most groups, is just a matter of time. So if you can, you look at some of the different chemistries that are and combinations that exist in each of the crops. That helps fit in a nice fashion, coordinated fashion with your crop rotation. I think that's valid, and you know, I would say that's good management. And the other thing that was mentioned, and maybe we don't mention enough, is really, you know, concentrate on that management of the crop. You know, there's the environment that we can't always control, but we can control you know, our choices in genetics and our choices in management, making sure our crops have the best, obviously, you know, water capacity, and that involves some no-till, but also involves, you know, some topography mapping, and or rely on some crop consultants that can help get that information and track that information, record it, including the herbicide groups and which crop was where, and you know, we've got a lot of digital tools now too that help you know, fit that that we didn't have you know, 10 years ago. So I think that's another piece around managing, recording, and continuing to rotate those groups and those crops.
Yeah, I think ideally, if you're growing wheat every 4 years, for example, use a group one as an example. If you're growing barley, you know, the other 1 in 4 years as your other cereal in rotation. Well, group one would probably be better for the barley in that example, and maybe a group two in wheat. But ideally, use different groups if possible. Yes, if you're rotating groups in other crops, bonus, but all things being equal, it'd be best to rotate the groups within the crop if you can.
Hmm.
And make
Now
sure
we
those
have,
crops are as
oh,
competitive as they can be. You know,
Yeah.
that's a really
yes.
key part too. I know we're talking a lot about weed control, but we know that management piece is, you know, those cultural mechanical practices that we can use or we think will be beneficial will help, you know, complement that integrated pest management approach.
Right. And so Jason Vogt actually, you know, is saying we can't spray our way out of resistance. We can't. It's true. So what are the best beneficial cultural controls to incorporate? So which ones are your favorites? So Mark, you've hit on at least one, which is of course growing the most competitive, healthiest, fastest growing crop. I think would be a great one. But where do you think agronomists or farmers could start in the cultural practices? Which ones do you think have the most bang for the buck?
At this point, a crop rotation, we've got a lot of corn on corn or, you know, corn soybean rotations. Let's try to get that wheat acre in there. It has given us other modes of action in the group four chemistry that we've used, and with a lot of success on some of these, you know, troublesome weeds and glyphosate resistant weeds, especially because we're not using glyphosate in crop in our cereals, in our wheat. And I think that's one piece right there. And just really, you know, manage, you know, from a preventative standpoint to, you know, where is equipment coming from? Is it being cleaned out? And you know, where is it moving to and from? There's a lot of other things we try to control, but we can't always control, you know, where water's moving. But we do some ditching, we do some of those kind of management practices around soil and water, and if we can, you know, just keep the birds from moving around. But again, those are things that are going to happen. We're just you know, we're just part of nature. We're just part of managing what we can, and you know, and especially in continuous cropping, you know, we need to be very diligent.
Yeah, and within crop diversity, mix it up the best you can. Fall seeded crops, a fall rye or winter wheat's not for everybody, but if you can grow a fall seeded crop every 4th year, for example, you may not need to spray the following spring, maybe not for a graminicide or grassy weed anyway. Even within your pulse, or if you can grow soybeans, you know, peas you can seed in April, right? Soybeans in a couple of years, if you come back to a pulse, you might not be seeding until the end of May. So that 6 week difference, that gap, you know, changes up your spray application timing to some extent. So there are subtle things we can do within crop diversity to help, you know, mix up the weed application timings and maybe even minimize or eliminate the need for a spray altogether.
Absolutely. Now, we do have a question here, and glyphosate has been, a key topic this year that we've been talking about just from an availability standpoint. But of course, we know there is a regulatory standpoint in some countries where access to glyphosate is perhaps reduced or eliminated entirely. Um, so if we are to take glyphosate out of the mix entirely, it complicates things significantly. And so we clearly don't necessarily have that in front of us, but how complicated does it become if you take glyphosate out of the mix entirely as far as weed control?
Very complicated. My head initially goes to potential other, options. There was glufosinate, a possible replacement. There would be nothing as good, arguably, at least initially, but, you know, glufosinate, for example, might be an option. Is there something that can be done with a diquat pre-seed, other relatively non-selective products? So we can maybe have a closer look at some of those other products. I heard paraquat, but that one's probably not a realistic option for getting through the registration process for that time of year. Um, but yeah, it'd be a difficult one to replace, but we'd have to look at some of those other options. Of course, tillage will probably come back to some extent, but that's not the
Mhm.
greatest economic practice if we can avoid tillage in general.
Yeah, and with that program approach, we can use those other groups, and typically they are offering some residual capacity that the glyphosate isn't. And you look at economics with multiple applications of glyphosate, or even higher rates at 2 liters an acre, and so on. That's not giving us any better weed control. It's making our weed resistance problem worse, and it's costing us a lot more. So we might as well look at these different modes of action, the different windows of application that we've talked about, and add some residual that helps get you through these different stages, especially that critical weed free period in all crops, but especially corn, soybeans, and wheat. And don't forget our forage rotation. We didn't talk about that a lot, but that's been very key as well. In having alfalfa in the rotation or clover, fairly competitive, and then gets us through into a post harvest situation where we can take advantage of the last few days of +5 to +25 in that range where we're still getting decent weed control, and again, maybe with some other groups, and I know that with the onset of new technologies, including enlist soybeans, and being able to tank mix glufosinate with enlist herbicide is again, was just mentioned. I think that's one of the non-selective products that could be really beneficial in using in the rotation.
We'd hate to lose a group nine, glyphosate being the only group nine. It's a good, it's good for breaking up other modes of resistance. But there are other potential combinations that could be looked at, whether it's a group two, like an imazethapyr with a group one or something pre-seed. So there are some combinations that could, control some key broadleaf and grassy weeds if we lost glyphosate, but that would just put more pressure on those modes of action that already have too much pressure on them already.
And as you mentioned, Rob, glyphosate really, um, it takes the place of tillage in a lot of places, right? And
Yeah.
so by removing it, you potentially bring tillage back as a major tool, and we know that that can have detrimental effects on our soil as well. So definitely a complicated one.
I like Jason's comment about
Yeah, for sure.
spray our way out of herbicide resistance. But when we do need to spray, when we spray, it's best if you can use the best mode of action for that particular problem, whether it's glyphosate pre-seed or a group one for wild oats in wheat or barley. So when we do have to spray, the best mode of action that gets us the best control is, the ideal way to go. So hopefully we can have all the tools available to us and maintain them for as long as we can.
And certainly a lot of cheap glyphosate has become its
Absolutely.
own enemy. So
And
as
I
the price changes, that will probably, bring back the creativity and what we used to do when we had non-GMO crops as well.
The creativity. I like how you put that. One final note, because we are running out of time. And yes, both of you mentioned rotation, and Marc, you might get a gold star for mentioning forages. And yes, I see that Peter and Ray DeBanco have already caught on to. I get happy about that because then I can feed it to my sheep. Yeah. So before we go, certainly thank you to both of you. This has been just an incredible evening of back and forth. I thank you both for doing this. This is for both of you your first time on this show. It's a lot to take on, so I really do appreciate it. The live format isn't for everybody, and it's been really fantastic. So thank you, Rob, and thank you, of course, for representing our show sponsor. We really do appreciate that. And Marc, thank you so much for joining us as well. And I hope this was painless and that you'll come back again another time.
You bet. We'll be happy to. Thanks very much.
No, it was fantastic, and thanks for everybody who tuned in. And we also want to, mention that we've got a lot of support, through the industry, growers that are very active. Continue to share the communication, rely on our resources. Whether it's at Ridgetown College and in Guelph and OMAF and in the MAPAC in Quebec, that have been very supportive and very active, around with issues around weed resistance.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. And of course, next week, please join me for another episode of the Agronomists. It is my birthday next Monday, and so I chose the topic, and we are talking about the value of manure, to the surprise of no one. All righty.
No shit.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Cheers, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks. Bye.